Okay, welcome back to my stream of consciousness. So you notice in this diagram that I have in front of you forever, Morgoth Dal. So Morgoth Dal is the federal government in that analogy. It's the Dao of Daos in the Behodler ecosystem. Morgoth Dal doesn't currently have a consensus mechanism well defined, but what it does do is it is the final owner of the various DAOs and DApps in Behodler. So although Limbo DAO manages the day-to-day running affairs of Limbo, at the point of migration, when you migrate a token to Behodler, you have to ask Morgoth DAO for permission for this to happen. So Morgoth DAO is the owner of the Behodler AMM. So there is a Morgoth DAO has its own form of proposals called powers, and a power is also just a kind of a once-off execution of a contract that performs a bunch of stuff on assets that belong to Morgoth. Now Morgoth DAO, as I said, it's a bit different in the consensus mechanism. So the way it works, the way it interfaces with Behodler is that it gives permanent permission to various addresses to have authority of these powers. So if you are a fan of the Silmarillion, then you'll remember that Melkor initially started off as this super powerful Valar, which is Tolkien speak for God, but not God capital G, God small g, like the Olympus gods. And he entered into Arda and into which is the kind of the planet in which Middle Earth is found. Well, I guess it wasn't technically a planet at first, it was a disk, but anyway, he enters into this realm and he wants to cause the maximum damage to kind of undermine the vision of God with a capital G, because he's fearful, he's jealous, he's, as they say, as it says in somewhere in the Silmarillion, amongst the Valar, Morgoth alone knows fear. So he's driven by fear, which leads to anger and hate and the dark side. So he strategizes in doing his evils in Arda, and the way he does that, funnily enough, is through decentralization. So he finds a bunch of minions and he pours out his evil and power into those minions, and he pours out his power into like areas of Middle Earth. So that's why like some forests in Middle Earth are like evil and all that, because Morgoth's influence is kind of poured into that. And so that's where like the dragons come from. The dragons aren't a natural creation. Morgoth, or Melkor rather, took some sort of lizard creature and turned it into like a super evil power lizard, and that's where dragons came from. And that's why dragons are inherently evil in the Tolkien universe. And orcs, he also to some extent empowered them, at least some of the orcs. And then of course Sauron, we know that Sauron's very powerful, but it's not clear how much of that power was poured out from Morgoth into Sauron versus Sauron just inheriting that in the first place. I suspect that Sauron wasn't particularly overpowered to start with, but slowly but surely Morgoth's like darkness poured into him, and so he became this vessel of Morgoth. So following in this cheery model, this is the inspiration behind Morgoth Dal. If you're not a fan of Tolkien, then Morgoth and Melkor are synonyms for the same person. The name is used depending on the context. Melkor is his original name, but Morgoth refers to his like dark presence in Middle Earth. So Morgoth DAO, this DAO of DAOs, it owns all the assets in the Behodler ecosystem, and the Morgoth DAO deputizes addresses or minions within the ecosystem to perform certain functions. So a minion is just an address. It can be a contract address or an externally owned address. So in this little setup, Morgoth DAO has deputized Limbo DAO to have very narrow power over migrating tokens to Behodler. So when a migration happens, Limbo invokes this power by going to Morgoth and saying, do I have permission to execute this power? Morgoth says yes. Limbo executes the power, and the token is then migrated from Limbo to Behodler. So that's how that's a kind of scheme in which Morgoth DAO fits. So just to refresh, Limbo DAO is for day-to-day running of Limbo. Morgoth DAO has the absolute final authority on which tokens can be listed on Behodler, so that we don't leave that up to democracy. And in time, that mechanism of deciding which tokens will need to be fleshed out more thoroughly into something that's either algorithmic or in itself has its own DAO. So there's for people interested in the ecosystem in general, there's a contract called Lachesis in that accompanies Behodler, and that's the gatekeeping contract which has the final say on which tokens are listed on the AMM. So the governance of Lachesis, that'll be something to think about in the future. For now, it's a little bit more informal, but nonetheless, that's how all these pieces fit together. You don't really need to, for the sake of this audit, understand Pyro tokens, but I've included in this diagram because it's incredibly important to the ecosystem, and if you do find yourself rifling through the Limbo code and you keep running into references to Pyro tokens, just mention it to me or mention it to someone on the team. It might be that perhaps your efforts in auditing or understanding the code would be assisted if we gave you more of a fleshing out of Pyro tokens. Anyone on the team, it doesn't have to be me, can give you infinite lectures on Pyro tokens, and probably far less verbose than the way I go about it. And we have Medium articles and so on. So there's a lot to talk about Pyro tokens. It's one of those things that's at once very simple and very complex. Yeah, you don't, as I said, if you're just here for the bounty and you just want to audit the Limbo code, you don't have to worry about Pyro tokens. But if you find that it's becoming a stumbling block, just let us know, and we can either release something like this again, or we'll just point you to the right resources. So now I think it's time to finally dive into the code base. So let me pause recording there. This might be a pause for you, or it might be an instantaneous transition, but for me it's a pause. I'll speak to you in my subjective few hours. Maybe for you it'll be a few seconds. Time travel commence.